This is Theory and Applications of Organizational Communication, and today we're going to discuss power and resistance. Historically, mainstream management and organization studies did not look at power and control because this ran contrary to their beliefs that organizations are rational sites of cooperation. However, research has shown that people in power in organizations may make choices that are not in other organizational members' best interests, which creates a situation that runs counter to the idea of a rational site of cooperation. This is where the concepts of power and resistance come into play in organizations, with certain organizational members wielding power and others trying to resist when their interests run counter to one another. So we're going to look at 3 different types of power that can show up in organizations to help break this down and understand what's going on. These are powers as coercion, power as consent, and power as governability. Power as coercion is one of the most direct ways of exerting power in an organization. It basically aims to keep organizational members at their tasks through direct pressures. Some early examples of this were punch clocks and company spies to identify troublemakers and union sympathizers. Coercive control processes are ways organizations try to get their members to work more, and do so in specific ways. It reduces autonomy and generally tends to create a distance between the organizational haves, who design the processes and implement them, and the organizational have-nots, who simply have to abide by the processes without input or autonomy. While we may think in some ways that we have progressed beyond this, today there are actually more ways to conduct surveillance on workers than there ever has been. For instance, truck drivers used to be extremely independent, but are now controlled by software-based fleet management systems that collect real-time data on where a trucker is at all times. Some companies even use wristbands on their workers, such as Amazon, who recently patented a tracking technology for where the workers' hands are and can even guide them to where they need to put their hands next. These forms of power and control are increasingly and particularly prevalent for low-paid workers. A second form of power is power as consent. This type of power does not aim to control an organizational member's behavior, as coercive power does, but rather to control how the person thinks and feels. The power comes from the ideologies that are communicated to members, thus constructing systems in which the member internalizes the ideology and will then self-police, so to speak. An example of this is the corporate culture movement of the 1980s, in which employees that served corporate goals of productivity and profit were praised and idealized. With power as consent, an organization tries to get all its members to be in line with a very narrow value system designed by the organization so they can be slightly autonomous, but only within the band of how the organization wants them to behave based on the ideologies they feed their members. This is very effective, particularly the self-policing component, because members may feel anxiety, guilt, or shame if they feel they aren't living up to the standards of their organization's culture, and therefore they will fall even more in line. Lastly, let's look at power as governability. This is not the easiest concept to explain, so I will do my best. Power as governability is considered the most modern and prevalent form of power. Basically, this approach poses that all individuals are different and are a sovereign individual who is an entrepreneur of him or herself. The power component that comes into play here is the broad narrative, the social norms that are driven home within this system, which is that all individuals seek to actualize themselves in all spheres of life, including work, and workers are meant to see themselves as on a permanent process of increasing their work value in order to this is important, save themselves from risk and insecurity. So basically, risk and insecurity are the norm as opposed to security. And risk and insecurity are used as features of control to get people to work more, harder, and in increasingly encompassing ways, as opposed to seeing work as something that is done simply to free the self to pursue other things. Basically, precarity is sold as the norm, and so people respond by devoting themselves to work to avoid this. That's it for now. The next topic we're going to cover is crisis and resilience.